England, 1822. The night at Ashworth arrived like a remembered dream. It was spring, and the air that drifted through the high, open windows of the ballroom was cool, carrying the faint perfume of orange blossom and damp earth, a scent that would always, in the years to come, call the memory of this evening back to them. Chandeliers hung like stars caught in a gilded net, their candlelight spilling across the polished floor in soft, wavering pools. Conversation, laughter, and the sad, sweet music of a string quartet skimmed across the room in polite, practiced ripples. It was a perfect pageant of aristocratic life, a flawless performance of elegance and ease. And out of that soft commotion moved three figures who, before the last waltz had been danced, would be carved into one another's lives like an old, impossible covenant. From his place by the grand fireplace, Cain Langford, the Duke, dark of hair and harder of jaw, watched the familiar scene with the profound weariness of a man playing a part he had long since tired of. He was a fixture in his own home, a portrait in a gilded frame. Even his notorious reputation, that of the Beast of Ashworth, felt like a costume he could no longer be bothered to wear. It was armor he had forged in the cynical fires of his youth, and he was only now beginning to realize he had become its prisoner. He felt the room change before he understood why. A subtle shift in the energy, a quiet intake of breath that was his alone. Then he saw her. Ginevra Wren stepped into the room as if she had always belonged to some photograph yet to be taken. The pale curve of her neck, the careless braid at the nape, the quiet courage of someone used to watching more than being watched. She did not scan the room for prospects or partners. Her gaze was thoughtful, her stillness a rebuke to the restless ambition that surrounded her. Beside him, Cain's twin brother Henry noticed her as well. But while Cain saw a storm and a stillness that called to the chaos in his own soul, Henry, who looked every Sunday at poetry as if it were scripture, noticed only how she held a book clutched against her ribs. In that small, protective gesture, he found companionship before he even knew what friendship might ask of him. They did not arrive bold or thunderous. The three of them existed in the house that night like three notes in the same chord, unheard by the crowd, but perfectly resonant with one another. Henry, with his open heart and easy smile, was the first to cross the floor. Cain watched from the shadows, a strange, possessive ache tightening in his chest as he saw his brother make her laugh. It was a laugh that did not ring through the room, but rather seemed to be a secret kept between the two of them. When Henry finally beckoned him over, Cain felt as though he were crossing a border into a new and terrifying country. The introduction was a formality of words, "Your Grace, Miss Wren." But the truth of the moment was in the brief, searing touch of their hands. A current passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that the world had just narrowed to the space of a few feet. "Henry tells me you find more truth in shadows than in sunlight," Cain said, his voice lower than he intended. Ginevra met his gaze without flinching. "Only that the most beautiful things, Your Grace, often grow in the dark." For a little while, their edges softened against the music and the murmured laughter. To the others, they were merely new ornaments of that gilded evening, another bloom in a familiar conservatory. But the house, with its long memory, seemed to hold its breath. In the years to come, people would speak of that spring as if it were the last peaceful hour before the weather changed. The first drop of rain fell late in the evening. Lady Albright, a woman from Cain's past who moved with the languid confidence of a predator, cornered him near the terrace. Her presence was a physical manifestation of the reputation he longed to shed. Her hand on his sleeve was a claim, her whispered words a reminder of the hollow man he had been. He was polite, his replies clipped, his jaw tight. He was trying to extricate himself without causing a scene when he looked up and saw that Ginevra was watching. She stood 20 feet away, her face partially obscured by a marble pillar. She could not hear their words. She could only see the picture, the beautiful worldly marchioness clinging to the Duke's arm. The Duke, stoic and unreadable, not pulling away. She saw a scene that confirmed every dark rumor she had ever heard. The terror of the moment was in its silence. Kane could feel the misunderstanding hardening into fact across the distance. He saw the light of curiosity in her eyes dim and die, replaced by the cool, settled disappointment of a truth verified. It was a quiet, devastating moment of emotional horror. The poison of his past had just found its mark. She did not glare. She did not storm away. She simply held his gaze for a long, final second, and in that look he felt a door quietly close. Then, with a grace that was more wounding than any anger, she turned and disappeared, back into the anonymous, glittering crowd. The night at Ashworth continued its perfect, polished performance, but something had irrevocably broken. The candlelight took the three of them in and let them disappear back into the world it had always known how to keep, but they were no longer the same. The first crack in the porcelain had appeared. Spring surrendered to the deep, drowsy warmth of summer, and a fragile peace settled over Ashworth. The season was a balm, turning the grounds into a lush tapestry of emerald and gold, and for a time it seemed as though the chill of that first disastrous night might finally begin to thaw. Ginevra Wren and her aunt remained at the estate. The invitation had been extended by Henry, an act of such open-hearted friendship that it could not be refused without causing offence. And so she stayed, a quiet, watchful presence that became the new centre of Kane's world. Her decision was a torment to him, a daily reminder of the gulf between them, and yet it was also a lifeline. Every morning he awoke with a singular, agonizing thought. She was still here. The wall of ice between them did not vanish, but it began to recede. It became a thin, clear pane of glass through which they could see each other, though they could not touch. She no longer fled a room when he entered. Instead, she would offer a cool, correct nod, her eyes meeting his for a fleeting, unreadable moment before returning to her book or her embroidery. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. Kane, for his part, began the quiet, solitary work of dismantling the fortress of his past. He knew with a certainty that was as terrifying as it was absolute, that the man he had been was unworthy of the woman he hoped she was. One afternoon, in the solitude of his study, a letter arrived on a silver tray. The paper was pale blue, the scent of lavender rising from it, a ghost of a life he no longer wanted. It was an invitation from Lady Albright, a relic from a time when his heart had been a locked room. He stared at the elegant, looping script and felt nothing but a profound weariness. In another life he might have answered. He might have indulged in the empty, predictable game. But now, the thought was a betrayal of the fragile hope that had taken root in his soul. Without reading past the salutation, he tossed the letter into the crackling fire and watched until the last of the lavender-scented ash had disappeared up the chimney. It was a private, unseen act of renunciation, a silent vow. The house, with its endless rooms and sprawling grounds, seemed to conspire to bring them together. He found her in the library, a shaft of dusty sunlight illuminating her as she stood on the rolling ladder, her fingers tracing the spines of leather-bound poetry. She was so lost in her search that she did not hear him approach. For a long moment he simply watched her, a privilege that felt stolen. "If you are looking for Shelley," he said, his voice quiet in the vast, silent room. "Henry keeps him on the lower shelf. He says he cannot bear to think of him gathering dust." She started, her hand flying to her throat. "Your Grace, I did not." "I know," he said softly. He moved to the shelf and retrieved a slim volume, its cover worn with affection. He held it out to her. As she took it, their fingers brushed. It was a touch that lasted no longer than a heartbeat, but it was enough to send a jolt through him, a current of heat and life that he felt to his very bones. She drew her hand back as if burned, her cheeks flushed. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the book's cover. She did not retreat from the room, and he counted it as a victory. Days later, he found her in the walled rose garden, a place his mother had loved. She was standing before a bush of pale, cream-colored roses, her expression thoughtful. "They are called the maiden's blush," he said, his voice startling her again. "My mother was fond of them." She said they were honest flowers. They cannot hide what they feel. Ginevra looked from the delicate, pink-tinged petals to his face. "Perhaps they are merely vulnerable, Your Grace," she replied, her voice soft but clear. "And find no shame in it." The words settled in the warm, fragrant air, and for a long moment Cain said nothing. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and understood that she was not speaking of flowers at all. She was speaking of him. She was offering a key to a door he had long kept locked, a language of vulnerability he had forgotten how to speak. He saw in her eyes a flicker of the woman from the ball, the one who saw truth in shadows, and he felt a hope so fierce it was almost painful. The summer deepened. The days grew long and humid, the air thick with the promise of rain. The fragile peace they had built was a delicate thing, a spider's web in the morning dew, and they both knew it could not last. The tension between them had grown from a spark to a low, steady flame, and it was only a matter of time before it caught fire. It happened in the conservatory. The sky had bruised to a dark, ominous purple, and the air was so heavy it felt difficult to breathe. He found her there, surrounded by the lush, exotic greenery, a captive in a glass world. The first drops of rain began to patter against the roof, a soft, hesitant rhythm that quickly grew into a deafening roar as the heavens opened. The storm they had been waiting for had finally arrived. "Miss Wren," he said, his voice barely audible above the deluge. She turned, her face pale in the strange, green-tinged light. In her eyes he saw not fear of the storm outside, but of the one gathering within the glass walls. The pretense of civility fell away. There was nowhere to retreat. "The world outside this room," he said, the words torn from him, raw and unplanned. "It ceases to matter when I am near you." Her breath hitched. The rain hammered against the glass, isolating them, sealing them in a world where only they existed. He took a step closer, then another, until he could see the frantic, beautiful pulse in the hollow of her throat. "I have spent my life," he continued, his voice a low, aching confession, "ensuring no one could ever truly see me. Yet I feel you see me all too well." "And what is it you believe I see?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "A man who is tired of the shadows," he said. He raised his hand, his fingers shaking as he brushed a stray curl from her cheek. Her skin was soft, electric. She did not pull away. Her stormy grey eyes searched his, full of 1,000 questions, of hurt and a desperate, burgeoning hope. He saw his own longing reflected there, a mirror to his own soul. "Ginevra," he breathed, her name both a sacrilege and a prayer. He lowered his head. Their lips were a whisper apart. The world narrowed to the scent of rain and flowers, to the warmth of her skin beneath his hand, to the promise of a kiss that would either save him or ruin him completely. A sharp rap on the glass door shattered the moment. They sprang apart, the spell violently broken. A footman stood at the entrance, his face a mask of polite neutrality. "Beg pardon, Your Grace. Lord Henry sent me. He was concerned Miss Wren might be frightened by the storm." The irony was a physical blow. Henry, his gentle brother, sending a servant to protect her from a storm, while he, the beast, was the true tempest from which she needed saving. Ginevra, her face flushed with a mixture of shame and something unreadable, gave a swift, jerky curtsy and swept past him, out of the conservatory, leaving Cain alone with the thunder, the rain, and the ghost of a kiss that now felt more real than any he had ever known. The ghost of the kiss they never shared haunted the halls of Ashworth. In the days that followed the storm in the conservatory, a new and more agonizing tension settled between Cain and Ginevra. The cool, polite distance was gone, replaced by a hyper-awareness so potent it was like a third person in the room with them. Every accidental glance was a jolt. Every shared silence was filled with the deafening sound of their unspoken feelings. It was a summer of almosts, a fragile piece that the narrator of any story would know was already doomed. Hope is a delicate thing, easily crushed, and the ghosts of Cain's past were not yet done with him. The estate's annual garden fete was held in late August, a final blaze of social glory before the season's end. The day was a masterpiece of summer, the sky a high, flawless blue, the air sweet with the scent of cut grass and blooming roses. Guests in pastel silks and crisp linen drifted across the lawns, their laughter echoing like distant bells. It was a perfect picture of idyllic life, so perfect that it felt like a lie. Cain, performing his duties as host, felt a sense of foreboding, a strange, prickling awareness that the beautiful, sunlit stage was set for a tragedy. He had been watching Ginevra from afar. She was speaking with Henry near the great oak tree, a vision in a gown the color of cornflowers. He saw the way she smiled at his brother, an easy, unguarded expression that she never showed him. The sight was a familiar ache, but today it was sharper. After the conservatory, he had allowed himself to hope. He had dared to believe she was beginning to see the man he wanted to be. He had built a castle of hope on the foundation of a single, interrupted moment, and he was about to learn how quickly such castles can turn to dust. Seeking a moment's refuge from the endless pleasantries, he slipped away into a more secluded part of the gardens, a shaded alcove formed by high, sculpted hedges. It was there that the ghost appeared. Lady Eleanor Desworth was a woman from a chapter of his life he had torn out and burned. She was beautiful, sharp-witted, and possessed of a casual cruelty that came from a lifetime of boredom. "Hiding from your own party, Cain?" she said, her voice a low purr. She stepped into the alcove, her silk gown rustling, effectively blocking the entrance. "Merely seeking a moment's peace, Eleanor," he replied, his tone weary but cold. "You have been cruel to your old friends this summer," she said, her eyes flicking pointedly toward the lawn where Ginevra stood. "One might think you have been captured." She took a step closer. "By a rather drab little wren." "That is enough," Cain said, his voice dropping, a clear warning. She ignored it, placing her hands on his chest. Her touch felt like a brand. "She is not for you, Cain. She is all poetry and delicate feelings. You are a beast. You would break her." She rose on her toes, her expression a strange mixture of desire and spite. "Let me remind you of the kind of woman you truly enjoy." Before he could react, she pressed her lips to his. It was a desperate, clumsy kiss, an act of possession, not passion. It was an invasion. He felt a surge of revulsion and a sharp, sudden panic, his hands coming up to her shoulders to push her away. It was in that exact moment, with his hands on her shoulders, her lips on his, that he looked past her and saw Ginevra. She had just rounded the hedge, a small, hopeful smile on her face, as if she had come looking for him. The smile vanished, frozen, and then shattered as she took in the scene. She could not see his resistance. She could not see the cold fury in his eyes, or the way his hands were pushing, not pulling. She saw only the picture, and the picture was a confirmation of every dark rumor, every whispered warning, every doubt she had ever harbored. He watched the hope he had so carefully nurtured for weeks turn to ash in her eyes. The fragile trust they had built, the unspoken understanding that had bloomed in the rose garden and nearly been sealed in the conservatory. It all evaporated in a single, devastating second. The light in her face did not just dim, it was extinguished. "Ginevra," he said, the name a choked sound in his throat as he shoved Eleanor away from him so forcefully she stumbled back against the hedge. But it was too late. Ginevra's face was a pale, blank mask of absolute heartbreak. She took a step back, then another, her movement jerky, uncoordinated. Her lips parted in a silent gasp of pain before she turned and fled, her blue dress a fading blur as she disappeared back down the path. A single fat drop of rain struck Kane's cheek, then another. The sky, which had been so clear moments before, was turning a bruised and angry grey. He ran after her, her name a useless shout on his lips. But she was already gone, swallowed by the labyrinthine gardens and the scattering crowd seeking shelter from the sudden downpour. He was left standing alone on the path, the sounds of the party fading, the rain beginning to fall in earnest, soaking his jacket, plastering his hair to his forehead. But he barely felt it. The summer, with all its fragile hope, had ended in that very moment, drowned in a garden of lies. The summer did not fade. It shattered. After the disaster at the garden fete, a great silence fell over Ashworth, a quiet so profound it was like the aftermath of a death. The house, which had been filled with the fragile hope of a new beginning, was now a tomb of unspoken words and averted gazes. Ginevra did not leave. To do so in the wake of such a public incident would have invited the very speculation she sought to avoid. So she stayed, and her presence was a constant low-grade fever in Kane's blood. They moved through the grand rooms like ghosts, haunting the same spaces but never occupying them together, the memory of the rain-soaked garden a chasm between them. It was Henry who, in a desperate attempt to break the unbearable stasis, accepted an invitation for them to join a week-long hunting party at the neighbouring estate of Lord Bristol. It was a socially unavoidable obligation, and for Kane, the prospect was a new circle of hell. He would be forced to perform the part of the gracious Duke, to smile and make small talk, all while the woman who had undone him was just a few feet away, her heart now firmly barred against him. Lord Bristol's estate was a flurry of forced cheer. The days were given over to the hunt, the evenings to lavish dinners and endless card games in the drawing-room. It was here, in this new, unfamiliar setting, that the new order of their lives became brutally clear. Henry was now Ginevra's shadow, her constant and gentle guardian. He was no longer just a friend to her, he was a shield. He stood between her and the world, and most pointedly, he stood between her and Kane. At dinner on the first night, Kane was seated at the head of the long, candle-lit table, a king presiding over a kingdom of ashes. Ginevra was placed halfway down, nestled safely between Henry and a talkative dowager. Kane had to navigate a tedious conversation about politics with Lord Bristol, but his entire being was focused on her. He watched the way the candlelight caught in her hair, the way she barely touched the food on her plate. She looked pale, fragile, and the sight of her quiet suffering was a blade twisting in his gut. Once, her eyes lifted and met his across the expanse of silver and crystal. The connection was immediate, a jolt of shared memory and pain, but she looked away in an instant, her expression shuttering into a cool, polite blankness. Later, in the drawing-room, He watched as Henry led her to a quiet corner, a book of poetry in his hand. They sat with their heads bent close together, finding refuge in a shared world of words that had no place for him. He saw other men in the room watch her, their gazes appreciative. A handsome, unmarried lord named Hemlock seemed particularly taken, his eyes following her with a persistent, calculating interest. Kane felt a surge of a primitive, possessive jealousy so potent it made his hands clench into fists at his sides. She was not his, he had no right, and yet the thought of another man even speaking her name was an intolerable agony. He was trapped. He could not approach her without causing a scene. He could not speak to her without Henry intervening with a polite but firm interruption. All he could do was watch from the gilded cage of his ducal propriety, as the distance between them grew from miles into oceans. The breaking point arrived on the fourth night. Kane had retreated to the library, feigning a headache, unable to endure another moment of the drawing-room charade. He stood in the shadows of a towering bookshelf, nursing a glass of brandy, when Henry entered with Lord Hemlock. They did not see him. Their backs were to him as they stood by the fire, their voices low. "Miss Wren is a remarkable woman," Lord Hemlock was saying, his tone one of genuine admiration. "Such grace, and a mind as sharp as any man's. A true gem." Kane stood frozen, the glass in his hand forgotten. "She is all of that and more," Henry replied, his voice quiet and heavy. There was a pause. "Tell me, Langford," Hemlock continued, his voice dropping slightly. "As her closest friend here, do you believe I might have a chance to press my suit?" "My intentions are, I assure you, entirely honorable." Kane's blood ran cold. He waited, his entire being focused on his brother's reply, a desperate, silent prayer on his lips. He wanted Henry to shut the man down, to protect her, to tell him she was not available. Instead, Henry's voice was filled with a sad, weary resignation. "She deserves a good man, my lord," Henry said slowly. "One who is steady and kind. One who will not bring chaos to her life." He turned slightly, his profile etched in the firelight. "I believe she would be very fortunate to receive your attentions. And I will do nothing to stand in your way." The word struck Kane with the force of a physical blow. It was a betrayal so profound, so complete, that it stole the air from his lungs. It was not just that Henry was giving her away, he was actively paving the path for another man. He was delivering her to a safe, boring, passionless life, judging Kane and finding him wanting. The rift that had been forming between them for months, the quiet resentments and unspoken accusations, had just fractured into an impassable chasm. He had not only lost the woman he loved, but now, in the most brutal way imaginable, he had just lost his brother. The journey back to Ashworth was a silent one, the three of them sealed in the carriage like figures in a tomb. The landscape outside had surrendered to late autumn. The trees were skeletal, their bare branches clawing at a sky the color of slate. A cold wind stripped the last of the dying leaves from their posts, and the world seemed to be preparing for a long and bitter winter. The decay of the season was a mirror to the decay of the bonds within the carriage. Hope, like the summer, was now just a memory. They returned to a house that no longer felt like a home. It was a stage for a tragedy, and they were its three tired actors. For 2 days, an unnerving quiet settled over the estate. Meals were tense, silent affairs. Ginevra was a ghost, her face pale and her eyes shadowed. Henry was a ghost of a different sort, his usual warmth and light extinguished, replaced by a grim, sorrowful resolve. And Kane was the epicenter of the silence, a storm of rage and betrayal held in check by the thinnest veneer of ducal propriety. On the third evening, the storm finally broke. Kane found his brother in the library, staring into the fire. The book on his lap was untouched. I heard you with Hemlock, Kane said, his voice quiet, devoid of all warmth. He did not approach the fire, but stood in the cool shadows near the door. Henry did not turn. I expected you might have... You would sell her off? Kane's voice was low, but the fury in it was a living thing. Pawn her off on the first dullard with a respectable name, just to be rid of the inconvenience? Finally Henry turned. The firelight caught the anguish on his face, a face so identical to Kane's, yet so utterly different in that moment. Is that what you think this is? He asked, his voice raw. An inconvenience? What else would you call it? Kane shot back, stepping forward into the light. You are my brother. My other half. And you stood there and delivered the woman I. He stopped, unable to say the word. The woman I love into the hands of another man. If that is not betrayal, then the word has no meaning. Love? Henry stood up, his own voice rising with a passion Kane had rarely heard from him. You speak of love. You who have treated hearts as a child treats toys, to be played with and then discarded? She is not one of your dalliances, Kane. She is not a bored marchioness looking for a diversion. She has a soul, and you will crush it. You know nothing of what I feel for her, Kane said, his words like ice. I know what I see, Henry retorted, taking a step toward him. I see a woman who weeps in private. I see a man who is too proud to offer a single word of explanation, a single moment of comfort. I saw what you did in the garden, and I have seen your silence ever since. I have defended you my entire life, Kane. I have stood in your shadow and excused your recklessness. But I will not do it with her. I would do anything to protect her from the heartbreak you will inevitably cause. Anything. He paused, his voice dropping to a painful whisper. Even protect her from you. The words hung in the air, terrible and final. The truth of their dynamic, the resentment and the roles they had played for a lifetime, was finally laid bare. Kane, the heir and the beast. Henry, the spare and the saint. Henry saw himself as Ginevra's protector, and he saw Kane as the monster she needed protection from. The lifelong bond between them, a thing Kane had taken for granted like the rising of the sun, fractured in that moment. He looked at his own face and saw a stranger, a judge, an enemy. He had lost Ginevra's trust, and now he had truly lost his brother. Without another word, Kane turned and walked out of the library, the silence he left behind more damning than any shout. He found himself walking the grounds, heedless of the cold wind that cut through his jacket. He was utterly alone, the king of a vast and empty kingdom of his own making. He was drawn, as if by some grim instinct, to the old abbey ruins at the edge of the estate, a place of beautiful, noble decay. He heard their voices before he saw them, soft on the wind. He stopped behind the crumbling stone wall of what was once the nave, his heart turning to a block of ice in his chest. Ginevra was seated on a fallen stone, her hands clasped in her lap, her shoulders slumped. Henry stood before her, his posture that of a man comforting a parishioner. I cannot bear it, Henry, Ginevra was saying, her voice a thin, desperate thread. Every dinner, every moment is a reminder of my own foolishness. To have believed even for a moment. She trailed off, her voice breaking. You must help me. I must leave this place. Henry's voice was a gentle murmur of comfort. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. After the winter ball, she pleaded, looking up at him, her face a pale, desperate plea in the fading light. Help me get away, Henry. Quietly, before anyone knows. It is the only way. Kane watched, frozen in the shadows, as his brother looked down at the woman they both loved. He saw the terrible, agonizing conflict in Henry's face, a war between love and loyalty. And he saw which side won. Henry gave a slow, solemn nod. It was a gesture of defeat, of sacrifice, and of profound, heartbreaking agreement. Cain backed away, silent as a ghost, his heart no longer breaking but broken. He had just witnessed the final seal on his fate. It was not a rescue he had seen. It was a conspiracy. They were united, their pact made in the ruins of a holy place. They were leaving together, and he was the man they were escaping. Winter did not arrive at Ashworth. It laid siege to it. Snow fell for 3 days, thick and silent, burying the world in a profound and breathless white. The estate became an island, its familiar landscapes rendered strange and new, its gardens and paths erased. The silence of the snow was a perfect match for the silence that now reigned within the great house, a cold that had seeped through the stone walls and settled deep into the hearts of its inhabitants. In the week leading up to the winter ball, the 3 of them moved through the halls like strangers. The bond between the brothers, once the central pillar of the house, was now a ruin. They exchanged only the clipped, necessary courtesies of a host and his guest, their shared face a constant, painful reminder of the chasm that now lay between them. Ginevra was even more remote, a pale, quiet figure who seemed to haunt the edges of every room, her presence a constant, aching question. Cain felt her gaze on him sometimes, heavy with a sorrow that mirrored his own, but she never spoke. There was nothing left to say. The house, oblivious to the human tragedy it contained, began to prepare for the ball. It was an exercise in brutal irony. Servants moved through the rooms with brisk efficiency, polishing silver that would only reflect sad faces and hanging garlands of evergreen whose fresh, sharp scent felt like a mockery of the decay within. In the kitchens, the cooks prepared a feast that Cain knew would taste like ash in his mouth. The musicians arrived, their instruments being tuned in the ballroom, the bright, hopeful notes echoing through the silent house. The estate was dressing itself for a celebration, unaware that it was truly preparing for a funeral. A farewell. On the day of the ball, Cain awoke to a world of blinding white. The snow had stopped, and a pale, watery sun made the landscape glitter. He felt nothing. The rage he had felt after the argument with Henry had burned out, leaving only a cold, hollow emptiness. The jealousy that had tormented him for months was gone, replaced by a profound and weary resignation. He had lost. He accepted it. He moved through the day like an automaton, inspecting the final arrangements, speaking with his steward, dressing in his formal attire. He looked at his reflection in the mirror. The dark suit, the starched cravat, the ducal signet on his finger, and saw a stranger. The man looking back at him was the Duke of Ashworth, a powerful, respected figure, but his eyes were empty. The beast had finally been tamed, not by love, but by utter and complete defeat. His only remaining duty was to preside over the end of his own world with grace. The guests began to arrive, a flood of color and sound that felt like an invasion. The ballroom filled with laughter, with the rustle of silk and satin, with the scent of perfume and wax. Cain stood at the entrance, a perfect mask of the gracious host, greeting his guests, smiling, making polite inquiries. He felt as though he were watching the scene from a great distance, a ghost at his own party. He was not waiting for anything, not hoping for anything. He was simply enduring the final moments. And then he saw them. They were announced, their names cutting through the genteel noise of the room. Lord Henry Langford and Miss Ginevra Wren. They entered together, and for a moment the entire, swirling room seemed to fall away, leaving only the 3 of them caught in a silent tableau. Ginevra was on Henry's arm. Her gown was the color of winter moonlight, a shimmering ethereal silver that made her look both beautiful and heartbreakingly fragile. Her face was pale, her expression one of quiet, sorrowful resolve. Henry stood beside her, his face a mirror of her own, his hand on her arm, not that of a lover, but of a solemn guardian. They were a united front, a silent, unassailable pact. This was their final act, their public farewell. Kane's heart, which he had thought to be a dead, frozen thing, gave a single, violent lurch of pure agony. This was the image that had haunted his nightmares, now made real. This was the visual confirmation of everything he had lost. He saw the truth. He was the outsider, the reason for their flight, the storm from which they were escaping together. The crowd did not see the tragedy. They saw only the Duke's handsome brother and his lovely companion. But Kane saw it all. He saw the end of his hope, the end of his love, and the end of his world, all walking toward him on his brother's arm. The longest night of his life had just begun. The moment arrived, as Kane knew it must. Lord Bristol, a man fond of tradition, tapped his wine-glass for silence. "And now," he announced with a beaming smile, "I believe our esteemed host, the Duke of Ashworth, has a performance to grace us with." Polite, expectant applause rippled through the ballroom. All eyes turned to Kane. He felt the weight of their gazes, the crushing burden of their expectations. They wanted a waltz. They wanted the charming, musically gifted Duke to provide a pleasant diversion. He inclined his head in a shallow, automatic bow and moved towards the grand piano at the far end of the room. He felt like a man walking to his own execution. He sat on the polished bench, the ivory keys cool and smooth beneath his fingers. He took a steadying breath, the practiced motion of a performer about to begin. For a moment, he considered playing the lie. He could give them their waltz, a hollow, glittering piece of music that meant nothing. He could perform his part one last time and then let them go. But as his fingers hovered over the keys, he looked up, and his eyes found them. They stood near the archway, poised for departure, a tragic and beautiful tableau. He saw the sorrow in Ginevra's face, the steadfast, protective loyalty in his brother's. And in that moment, the lie became impossible. Pride, which had been his constant companion for months, crumbled into dust. All that was left was the raw, unbearable truth of his love and his loss. He would not play the waltz. He would tell the truth. He closed his eyes, and his hands came down on the keys. The first notes that fell into the expectant silence were not of a waltz. They were quiet, solitary, and achingly mournful. It was the sound of a vast and empty house, of a man walking through hollow rooms. The melody was a simple, melancholic theme that spoke of a loneliness so profound it had forgotten its own name. The chatter in the ballroom died, replaced by a confused, listening stillness. Then the theme shifted. A new chord, one of questioning and surprise, altered the melody. It grew brighter, more lyrical, swelling with a sudden, desperate hope. It was the sound of a world tilting on its axis, of a candle being lit in a dark room. It was the music of the first glance, of a soul recognizing its counterpart across a crowded floor. He risked a look at her. Ginevra was frozen, her hand clutching Henry's arm, her eyes wide. She recognized the moment. She was hearing their beginning. The music deepened, growing more complex. The left hand introduced a turbulent, questioning rhythm, while the right hand played a soaring, romantic phrase. It was the sound of the summer, of stolen moments and conversations in the rose garden, of a hope so fierce it was almost painful. It was the sound of two people circling each other, pulled by a force they could not name, a dance of longing and restraint. And then the storm broke. The music swelled, the notes crashing like thunder, a furious, passionate expression of the fire that had been trapped beneath the glass of the conservatory. It was a desperate, chaotic plea, a question screamed without words. Did you not feel it too? As the chords crashed with the memory of a summer storm, Henry looked at Ginevra's stricken face, and a terrible understanding began to dawn in his eyes. The melody fractured. It became halting, dissonant, stumbling over itself in a sharp, painful minor key. It was the sound of a lie, of a garden turned to poison, of a trust shattered. It was a cry of innocence, a frantic, desperate attempt to explain the unexplainable. The notes were a torrent of pain and regret, the sound of a man watching his entire world turn to ash. The music wept, and across the room, a single tear traced a path down Ginevra's pale cheek. Then another. Her body began to tremble, her carefully constructed composure undone by the raw, undeniable truth of the music. Finally the storm passed. The fury and the pain receded, leaving a quiet, heartbreaking theme of surrender. It was the melody of autumn, of watching her from afar, of accepting his loss. But beneath the profound sadness, a single, pure melody remained. It was the theme of his love, stripped of all hope and expectation, but unwavering and true. It was a love so deep it could only express itself in sacrifice. The last chord was soft, a quiet resolution of C major that hung in the air for a long, shimmering moment. It was a final, whispered goodbye. Kane let his hands fall from the keys into his lap. The silence that followed was absolute, more profound than any sound he had ever known. It stretched for an eternity, a collective held breath. He opened his eyes and looked at her. Tears were streaming down her face, silent and unchecked. This was not the polite weeping of a woman moved by a pretty tune. This was the raw, uncontrolled grief of a heart breaking and healing all at once. She understood. The crowd, finally shaking off the spell, erupted into thunderous applause. They thought it was art, a masterful, emotional performance. They did not understand they had just witnessed a man bleed his soul out onto the keys. Through the roar of the applause, Kane saw Henry move. His brother's face was a mask of devastation, of awe, of a dawning, unbearable truth. He gently released Ginevra's arm and crossed the floor, the crowd parting for him. He reached the piano, and without a word, he pulled Kane from the bench and into a fierce, tight embrace. The applause continued, interpreting this as a moment of brotherly pride. Henry held him, his grip like iron, and leaned close to his ear. His voice was a raw, choked whisper that cut through the noise, a whisper meant only for Kane. "My brother," he said, his voice thick with a love that was both a comfort and a wound. "Be happy. It is you she truly loves." The applause had faded. The guests, with their cloaks and carriages and final polite farewells, had melted away into the snowy night, leaving behind a house that seemed to exhale a long, collective sigh. The ballroom was a gilded ghost, haunted by the scent of snuffed candles and the lingering memory of music. Garlands of evergreen drooped from the mantels, and a single forgotten glove lay on the polished floor like a fallen dove. The war was over, but the battlefield was still littered with the beautiful debris of the fight. Kane stood in the center of the empty room, his brother's words still echoing in the silence of his mind. "It is you she truly loves." The phrase was both a balm and a blade, a source of impossible hope and profound, aching guilt. Henry was gone. After their brief, world-altering embrace, his brother had simply nodded, his face a mask of unbearable sorrow, and had disappeared up the great staircase. He had not sought out Ginevra. He had not said a final goodbye. He had simply vanished, leaving the two of them to face the wreckage he had cleared a path through. Kane knew he had to find her. This silence, the one that now stood between them, was different from the one before. It was not a wall of ice, but a fragile, shimmering space filled with unspoken, terrifying possibilities. He found her in the library. She was standing by the window, looking out at the moonlit, snow-covered grounds, her arms wrapped around herself as if to keep from falling apart. She was not weeping now. Her face, reflected in the dark glass, was one of quiet, exhausted stillness. She had been waiting. He did not speak as he crossed the room, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug. He stopped a few feet behind her. For a long moment, they both just stood there, watching the snow. "The music," she said finally, her voice a soft whisper that fogged the cold glass. "It was your truth." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. "It was the only way I knew how to tell it," he replied, his own voice raw. She turned slowly to face him. Her eyes were shadowed, her face pale, but for the first time since that first night, she was looking at him without a guard, without a shield. Her heart was in her eyes, open and vulnerable. "The garden," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "That afternoon." "She kissed me," Kane said, the words simple, direct, stripped of all pride. "I did not kiss her back. I was pushing her away when you saw—" A single tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. "I only saw what the world had already told me you were," she whispered. It was easier to believe the rumor than to believe the man. "And the man?" he asked, his heart in his throat. "What do you believe of him now?" She took a small, hesitant step toward him. "I believe he has been living in a fortress of his own making for so long that he has forgotten the door was never locked." The truth of her words settled over him, a profound and humbling weight. He had been his own jailer. His pride, his fear, his reputation, they were all bars he had forged himself. "I love you, Ginevra," he said, the three words feeling both terrifyingly new and as ancient as his own soul. "I think I have loved you from the moment I first saw you across the ballroom. A love so fierce it frightened me. I did not know what to do with it, so I did nothing, and my silence almost cost me everything." "It almost cost us both," she corrected softly, taking another step. She was close now, so close he could feel the warmth radiating from her, could see the intricate pattern of grey and blue in her eyes. "My fear was a fortress, too." She raised a hand, her fingers trembling as she gently touched his cheek, his jaw. "I love you, Kane." And with that, the last of the walls crumbled into dust. He closed the final inch of space between them and lowered his head. Their first kiss was not one of desperate, pent-up passion. It was a moment of profound, breathtaking relief. It was quiet, it was reverent, and it was a homecoming. It tasted of salt from her tears and of a forgiveness so complete it felt like a benediction. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, and felt the solid, real warmth of her in his embrace, a feeling he had only ever dreamed of. It was the end of the loneliness. It was the end of the war. They stood there for a long time, wrapped in a silence that was no longer empty, but full of a new and beautiful peace. The future, which had been a terrifying, blank unknown, suddenly felt like a promise. The moment was broken by a soft, hesitant knock on the library door. They pulled apart reluctantly. Kane, still holding Ginevra's hand, called, "Enter." It was a young footman, his face pale and his eyes averted. He carried a single letter on a silver tray. "From Lord Henry, Your Grace," the footman said, his voice barely a whisper. "He asked that you receive it immediately. He is gone." The word hung in the air, cold and final. "Gone." Kane's hand tightened on Ginevra's. He took the letter from the tray. It was addressed to him in his brother's familiar, elegant script. He broke the wax seal, his heart turning to a block of ice. The joy of the last few moments felt like a dream that was already fading. He unfolded the single sheet of paper and read the first line. "My dearest brother, if you are reading this, then I have done what I must, and you are with her. Do not feel guilty. This is not a punishment, it is a gift." The joy had not been a dream. It was real. But the cost of it, he was only just beginning to understand, was a price paid by his brother. The snows of that long, fateful winter had melted, and 2 springs had since passed over Ashworth, each one painting the world in the tender, hopeful colours of rebirth. A year had turned. The house, which had once been a stage for their tragedy, had slowly, quietly become a home. The love that had been confessed in a moment of desperate, cathartic revelation had now settled into the steady, breathing rhythm of a shared life. Theirs was a love story that had begun in a storm and now found its truest expression in the quiet. It was in the way Ginevra would look up from her book in the library and find Cain's eyes already on her, a soft, private smile passing between them. It was in the way he would seek her out in the afternoons, abandoning his ledgers and estate papers to walk with her in the rose garden, their hands clasped, their conversation easy and meandering. The Beast of Ashworth was a ghost of the past, a story told about a different man. The man who existed now was quieter, his smiles more frequent, the harsh lines around his eyes softened by a peace he had never thought to know. They were happy. It was a deep and profound happiness, built on a foundation of brutal honesty and hard-won forgiveness. And yet it was not perfect. A shadow lingered at the edge of their joy, a quiet, persistent ache. The shadow had a name: Henry. His self-imposed exile was a wound that had not yet fully healed. Though they knew his sacrifice had been an act of love, it was a debt they did not know how to repay. A portrait of the 2 brothers, painted when they were boys, hung in the long gallery. They were depicted standing side by side, identical in face and form, a single, indivisible unit. Sometimes Ginevra would find Cain standing before it, his expression a mixture of love and a deep, abiding sorrow, and she would slip her hand into his, offering a silent comfort that needed no words. They wrote to him every week. Cain's letters were full of the details of the estate, of the tenants and the harvests, an unspoken plea for his brother to remember his home. Ginevra's were full of descriptions of the books she was reading, the flowers blooming in the garden, a gentle echo of the friendship that had once been her only safe harbour at Ashworth. Henry's replies came faithfully, postmarked from Florence, from Rome, from Venice. His letters were beautiful, filled with lyrical descriptions of art and architecture, of sun-drenched Italian landscapes and ancient ruins. But they were the letters of a traveller, not an exile. He spoke of his life with a calm, philosophical detachment, never hinting at loneliness, and always deflecting their pleas for him to return with a gentle, "Perhaps next season." It was a kindness that felt like a carefully constructed wall. One rainy afternoon, Cain found Ginevra in the library, a slim volume of Shelley in her hands, the very book he had retrieved for her on that first day. She was not reading it, but simply holding it, her expression lost and sad. "His absence is a part of our story, isn't it?" she said quietly, as he came to stand beside her. Cain looked at the book, at the memory of his brother's easy passion for poetry. "I fear our happiness was built upon his." Ginevra turned to him, her grey eyes clear and steady. She placed a hand on his chest, over his heart. "Our happiness does not diminish his, Cain. We must believe he is finding his own. Henry's love is not a selfish thing. The gift he gave us was meant to be enjoyed, not mourned." He knew she was right. He drew her into his arms, his chin resting on the top of her head, and for a long time they stood there together, 2 halves of a whole, strong enough now to bear the weight of their own complicated joy. It was a week later that the letter arrived, It was delivered on the morning mail tray, and Kane recognized his brother's familiar script instantly. But there was something different about it. The paper was thicker, the wax seal a different color. He broke it open with a sense of nervous anticipation. He read the first page in silence, his expression shifting from curiosity to stunned disbelief. "What is it?" Ginevra asked, watching him from her seat across the breakfast table. He looked up, his eyes wide. "He's coming home," he said, his voice a near whisper. He cleared his throat and read from the letter, his voice growing stronger with a hope he had not allowed himself to feel for over a year. "The continent has offered me all the beauty it possesses, but my heart, I find, is irrevocably English. I have decided it is time to come home to Ashworth. I plan to arrive by the end of the month." A brilliant, tearful smile broke across Ginevra's face. "Oh, Kane." "There is more," he said, his eyes scanning the bottom of the page. He paused, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. He read the final line aloud, slowly, as if tasting the words. "I will not, however, be returning alone." The last month of spring was a period of breathless anticipation at Ashworth. The future, which had once seemed a settled, quiet thing, was now uncertain again. But this time, the uncertainty was laced with a fragile, thrilling hope. Henry was coming home. On the day of his expected arrival, the estate was in full, glorious bloom, as if the very grounds were dressing themselves for a reunion. The air was warm, sweet with the scent of roses and freshly cut grass. Kane and Ginevra stood together on the grand stone steps at the front of the house, waiting. His hand rested on the small of her back, a simple, steady gesture of a man completely at peace in his love. They were a united front, ready to face whatever this new chapter held, together. Late in the afternoon, a carriage crested the hill. It moved slowly down the long, winding drive, the crunch of its wheels on the gravel the only sound in the quiet air. The carriage stopped. A footman opened the door, and Henry stepped out. The narrator of their story, who had watched them through seasons of sorrow, could now describe a man remade. He was the same Henry, his face a perfect mirror of his brother's, but the tentative, sorrowful weight he had once carried was gone. The Italian sun had warmed his skin, and a new confidence had settled in his eyes. He was no longer the spare, the shadow, but a man who had walked through the world and found his own place in it. He smiled as he saw them, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached his eyes. The reunion was not one of dramatic, tearful embraces. It was something quieter and more profound. Kane descended the steps, and the two brothers met on the drive. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, a year of unspoken words passing between them in a single, silent gaze. Then Kane pulled his brother into a fierce, heartfelt hug. It was a hug of forgiveness, of gratitude, and of a love that had been tested and had endured. Henry then turned to Ginevra. He took both her hands in his. "Ginevra," he said, his voice warm, "I have never seen you look so happy." "It is good to have you home, Henry," she replied, her own voice thick with emotion. As they spoke, another man stepped out of the carriage, a young, bright-eyed Italian with a portfolio under his arm. Henry introduced him as Signor Vianelli, a brilliant young architect whom he had taken under his patronage. He spoke with passion about their plans to restore the old, crumbling east wing of the estate, to build a new library and a conservatory that would rival any in England. In that moment, Kane and Ginevra understood. Henry had not returned with a new love. He had returned with a new life. He had found his own purpose, his own passion, entirely separate from the duties and titles of Ashworth. He was not a man returning to a life he had lost. He was a man bringing a new world home with him. Later that evening, as a soft twilight settled over the gardens, the three of them walked together along the familiar paths. I must confess, Henry said, breaking a comfortable silence. My letters were not entirely truthful. Cain and Ginevra glanced at him. I wrote of my travels as a diversion. He continued, but they were, in fact, a liberation. That night, my leaving was not the sacrifice you believe it to be. He stopped and looked at them, his face serious in the fading light. It was the first choice I ever made that was truly my own. It forced me to find a world beyond my brother's shadow. You did not build your happiness on my sorrow. You simply showed me the door to my own freedom, and for that I will be forever grateful. It was the final absolution they needed. The last vestiges of their shared guilt lifted, disappearing into the twilight like a dissipating mist. They were no longer three figures in a tragedy, but three friends, whole and healed, standing together at the start of a new season. The next morning, Cain and Ginevra stood on the balcony of their rooms, watching the sun rise over their estate. A soft, golden light spread across the dew-kissed lawns and ancient trees. The world felt new, washed clean. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. Their love was no longer a storm or a confession or a question. It was a quiet, certain thing, as steady and as reliable as the dawn. "And what of our story?" she whispered, looking up at him. He smiled, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "I believe it is just beginning." The sun rose higher, flooding the world with a bright, warm light. The house behind them was peaceful, filled with the promise of a happy future. The story of the Duke and his identical brother was over. The story of Cain and Ginevra, a quiet, enduring story of a sweet and lasting love, would continue for all the bright mornings to come.